One of the best books I've read for female cyclists in a long time is Up to Speed, The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes by Christine Yu. This book was so good that by the time I was done with it, I had all kinds of pages dog-eared. I had highlighted lots of passages, and I knew that I absolutely had to get Christine on this podcast for y'all. The book discusses the available science on female athletes, but also the lack of it. It turns out that so much of the conventional wisdom that we've absorbed over the years is based on research done on men. We talk about why this is, and despite the lack of data, Christine also shares the most up-to-date science with us that we can apply in our daily lives. This has to do with tracking our menstrual cycles, getting enough to eat, and continuing to be athletic through all of our life transitions. This is an interview you're not going to want to miss. It has so much actionable information for y'all. And with no further ado, let's jump right in.
I am a journalist. I cover sports and science and health. And, generally kind of my jam, the things that I really like to dig into are really stories about women's sports, women athletes, and in particular, this intersection, right, with sports science and really trying to understand how the human body performs, how we get injured, how we get better, those types of things. I live in Brooklyn, New York, with my husband and 2 kids. I was just saying, like, I'm really ready for fall weather. We're like mid-September right now. I'm ready for the cooler weather around here. It's been hot and humid.
Why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that it in part came out of just conversations that I was having with athletes kind of at all levels, and particularly, kind of elite and professional athletes, women athletes, as well as experts in the field. A lot of the sports scientists that I would talk to for stories I was writing, kind of as a side conversation would say something along the lines of like, oh yeah, but we kind of don't really know what goes on in women, like as this offhand remark. And I was like, what do you mean by that? Like, what are you talking about? And they say, oh yeah, we don't really know that much in women. We haven't really studied women all that much. And it kind of made me really curious, right? Like, how is it at this point, it was probably 2018, 2019, when I was having these conversations, and how is it that we've gotten this far and, women's sports has progressed so much, and yet there's this huge gap in information and knowledge and research. Like, why is this happening?
Yeah.
So it kind of led me down this rabbit hole to try to figure out what was going on. But more importantly than that was, this question in the back of my mind was, well, if we don't study women, like, what's the implications of that, right? Like, what does that mean for girls and women in sport, not only in terms of performance, right, but in terms of health and longevity and injury and just long-term athlete development? What were the implications if we weren't studying this population?
Yeah. And I think that for me was the most shocking part of the book. And it was something I had first read about a little bit in Roar by Dr. Stacy Sims, who you reference in the book quite a bit. But up until I had read that book, it had never even occurred to me before that all this advice we were getting was based on men and maybe doesn't even apply to us. And that's something I don't even think definitely the general population doesn't realize, but women athletes don't even realize, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think for me too, as a journalist, realizing this, again, around 2017, 2018, around this point, realizing that these studies that I was citing in my articles, were primarily conducted with like young college age men, right? Who are generally cyclists, like they're doing some sort of cycling trial of some sort. Not really like thinking about like, or just assuming, right, that those findings could be generalized. And it really made me wonder, like, was I doing a disservice here, right? Like, am I providing not the right or appropriate information?
Right.
It's somewhat concerning. But also just, I think the realization that like, I'm someone who was fairly seeped in this like field, right? Or kind of at least have a decent knowledge base of what's going on, but it wasn't even something that I thought about, right? Even in terms of my own, physical fitness and injury prevention and performance and all of this other stuff. Like, it didn't even cross my mind. And so there was a point in which I got kind of mad too,
Mm-hmm.
because really realizing like, oh my gosh, we don't know this much anything about our bodies.
Yep.
And why is that? And that doesn't seem right.
No, it doesn't. The craziest thing to me too is I'm a USA cycling coach. I'm certified. I've taken all these, tests, and never ever in any of that research, never in the testing, never was that ever once mentioned that like all of this stuff you're learning may or may not be applicable to women, which is crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, something that you had said before too is that, does this even apply to us?
Mm-hmm.
Or, what is it even applicable? And I think for me, that was another deeper question as well. Like, along with trying to understand the implications of it, was really trying to understand, well, yes, like, does it apply? To what extent does it apply? And like, again, like, where are the gaps and where is the overlap? Because I think that's one piece that can tend to get lost in a lot of this kind of hoopla about like women are understudied, is this assumption that like what applies to men definitely doesn't apply to women.
Mm-hmm.
But it's much more nuanced than that, right?
Right.
Like everything in life, there's like so much gray area. And so for me, what was really interesting is trying to understand some of that nuance too, between, okay, what makes a difference, what doesn't
Mm-hmm.
make a difference, like what do we, where does it make sense to kind of put our attention,
Mm-hmm.
and where can we, where are there areas where we can kind of generalize between sexes
Mm-hmm.
and genders.
You mentioned a lot of reasons why there's not much data and research on women athletes. Can you just tell us maybe what a couple of the biggest reasons are?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I spoke to most experts and asked them this question, their response largely was that because scientists thought women were complicated to research, right? And it makes sense when you think about like the scientific method and scientific methodology. Like, scientists want to like simplify things, right? They want to understand how a specific chemical reaction works, or how a hormone works, or the purpose of this amino acid, or whatever it is, right? And they want to kind of weed out all the other noise and data that might not pertain to that very specific question that they're asking. So when you have a female body that has a menstrual cycle, that does have hormones that fluctuate up and down through the course of the month in a very unpredictable way, it's a lot of extra noise. And so it's just easier and cleaner, to study men where that hormonal environment doesn't fluctuate to the same extent, right? It's easier to control for some of those other variables. So I think like on a very practical level, that's one piece of it. But I think if you step back kind of and look at it from more of a macro lens, I think it has more to do with just how the systems of sports and science were developed from the beginning. Like, both of those systems were developed for men, by men, or with men in mind. And so when you kind of create a system or create a way of doing things, right, that privies one population, that just becomes the way you do things over time, and you don't even question it. You know what I mean? Like, it creates these blind spots that you're not even necessarily aware of until someone starts asking questions, right? So I think that's like those two things. It's like on a very practical level, it's just easier to study men because you don't have all this other like stuff to control for. But on a more macro level, it's just the way the system was developed in the first place, and so that just became the way things are.
Yeah. What data does not exist today that you wish did, that you think would be very helpful for women? Like you were doing all your research and you're like, this would be a great question to be able to answer, but I can't answer it because the information doesn't exist. What would that be for you?
Oh my gosh, that's a really great question. I think on a selfish level, for me, it's all the data and the information about what happens around the menopause transition and kind of later in life, and what happens when those female sex hormones start to decline, and their levels kind of decrease, right, so much. And what do you do about that? Right? Like
Yeah.
what happens? And so, like selfishly for me, that's a really interesting piece, because
Yeah.
I think we've studied a lot about, I mean, kind of studied, at least have somewhat of an understanding on the other side, right? With puberty and adolescence, when these hormones first start to surge, and what happens to our reproductive systems, and what happens, to other systems like our bone health and cardiovascular health and all these other things. But we don't know what happens on the other end very well, right?
Yeah.
We have some general understanding about certain things more from a health perspective than from like a athletic or performance health perspective. So that's personally the piece that I'm, really interested in, and just because that closes the loop a little bit more in terms of this lifespan that women go through,
Mm-hmm.
and these different transitions in hormones and physiology, that we just really don't have a good grasp on.
Yeah. I thought one of the things that you mentioned in the book was, I don't know if it was peri and post menopause, but you'll spend half to a third, or like 1/3 to 1/2 of your life in that period of your life. And I think as women cyclists, many didn't start until later, and we hope to continue for the rest of our lives. So we might spend more than half of our cycling
Yeah.
careers in that period. And yeah, it would be amazing to have more data and research on it.
Yeah. And I mean, and I think along with that too, now I'm just thinking of these other questions that I
Yeah.
have, but also in terms of what knowing more and understanding more about like hormonal birth control too,
Mhm.
because so many girls and women are on hormonal birth control. And we kind of, at least from my experience, like I didn't really think a lot about what that meant to take it, right? Aside from just trying to prevent pregnancy,
Right.
but really trying to understand what those different hormonal, those formulations of the hormones are, what that means for your body,
Yeah.
how long you should be taking it, right? Like I said, like I'm kind of in this tail end of, not tail end, I guess, but like more mature adulthood,
Hmm.
right? But like I have friends who are talking or, asking me questions too, like in terms of, yes, we're obviously in this kind of phase where we're either in or approaching perimenopause, but they're still taking hormonal birth control. It's like, should that be the thing that they're
Mm.
doing? Like, should they be doing it until they know for sure they're not going to have a period anymore? You know what I mean? Like, I think
Yeah.
that there are a lot of questions in terms of like, how do we manage this in a way that makes sense?
Hmm.
Um, and, for our lives, like now and, athletically and, in all the different dimensions.
Yeah. I was on hormonal birth control for many, many years, and then ended up with a blood clot and found out I could no longer take hormonal birth control, and had to start learning like how to track my cycle and do all of that. And that was so like mind blowing for me, because I was almost 30 years old at that point and had never learned anything about my menstrual cycle. It's just something that we were not taught as girls, and I think it's so sad. I loved that you included that in the book. um you also mentioned this idea of, I think you called it me search, right? Like tracking your cycle and seeing how it is affecting your training and how you're feeling. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, to your point that, I probably was in my mid 30s when I really started to pay attention to, or to understand the whole, like the vast implications
Mm-hmm.
of the menstrual cycle. Because, to be honest, I only thought about it in terms of like, oh, these couple of days that I bleed, and
Mm-hmm.
like just get through the rest of the, like, kind of
Yeah.
anticipating those days and making sure I like had, some sort of menstrual products on hand, but like not understanding the impact it had throughout the month, right? That these hormones are fluctuating. So I think that, you know, to your point, that it is so important that we get this information out there to girls and women, frankly, because we only talk about menstrual cycles in terms of fertility, and we ignore all these other vast implications. But like your cycle is it's just part of your physiology,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's something that, it is what it is. It's normal. It's not neither good, neither bad. Like it's just part of your body, like your heart is,
Yeah.
like your lungs are. And so I think on the one hand, tracking your cycle and paying attention to that is really empowering, right? Like it's a way for you to kind of understand what's going on with your body, and not at least from my experience, it was more this realization that not everything was my fault. If like I felt off with a training day or something like that, or I just felt really tired or flat, or whatever it wasn't necessarily my fault. It might have something to do with my cycle. And that's to say, like, not everything has to do with your cycle, right? But it might be related. And so that kind of gave me just more information about what was going on with my body. So I feel like that's a really important thing for everyone. I think where we get into some kind of sticky things with cycle like tracking and cycle syncing and all of this stuff is that we go from this place of wanting more information about what's going on with our bodies and how the menstrual cycle impacts us to wanting like the answers, right? The answers of like, well, what do I do? How do I, if estrogen is potentially helpful for X, how can I harness that, right? Like it's almost like how can I hack this? How can I create this shortcut? So I think that's where we kind of get into some potential troubles when we're looking to use the cycle as like a hack, a performance hack, right? Because there's so much variability in, cycles across the board. So like your cycle is very different from my cycle, is very different from, someone else. And it doesn't matter if we're the same age, on the same day of our cycle, or whatever it is, the levels and ratios of our hormones are going to be different. And then for any one person, those levels and ratios of hormones are also going to probably change month to month and definitely over the lifespan, right? So it's hard to say like create some sort of like generalized plan for what to do. But I think like, again, the cycle tracking and the cycle kind of paying attention to your cycle in terms of athletic performance really is about kind of tapping into your own body and what it's doing and paying attention, like I said, to those symptoms that might be cycle related. So like I said, like not everything is necessarily cycle related, but if you're tracking and you notice like every month, around my third week, I experience like I'm flat, like, oh, well then maybe that does have something to do with my hormone levels versus like if that kind of flatness is more variable, right? Like there's no pattern to it necessarily. But if it is something that seems to be a pattern, like then you can actually maybe do something about it in terms of, how you recover or what your nutrition is, or making sure you're hydrating, or whatever, or like even kind of altering your training a little bit to kind of front load like higher volume, more intense stuff into phases in which you're feeling more energetic. But I think that's very different from saying like day 12 of your cycle, do this HIIT workout or something like that.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
It does.
So I think that like, again, it's this nuance, right? That's kind of hard to explain in social media, hard to explain in a TikTok or, something like that. But like, I think it's those types of nuances that are really important for people to kind of tease apart for themselves.
We had a chapter on nutrition, on eating enough food, and that chapter really spoke to me because I think as cyclists, and especially female cyclists, there's always this idea that, you have a power weight ratio, and the thinner you are, the faster you're going to be. And that's just in reality not the case. And in the last couple of years, I've started eating a lot more and noticed, I haven't gained a bunch of weight. I've just gotten faster on the bike, and it's great. Can you talk a little bit about that and like what you found were the consequences of not eating enough food?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard, especially for girls or women, like regardless of sport, just living in these bodies that we are in our society now, and like just so much pressure to look a certain way, to be thin, all of these things. Add on top of that, doing an endurance sport like cycling, where you said, right, body composition plays a role in performance. I think where we get tripped up is that we start to see body composition and these ratios and all this stuff, right, as like the answer to performance, as the only way to get better, get faster, and all of that. And we almost like overemphasize it at the detriment of the athlete's like health and long-term development. So what happens, kind of just backing up on like a big picture again, right? Like what happens is like when your body doesn't have enough fuel, right, or it senses that it doesn't have enough fuel, it starts to think it's starving, right? And the body's main goal is to survive. So in order to survive, it starts to shut down some of these non-essential systems, of which like reproductive system is one of them. It's one of the first to go. So that means like your hormones start to tick down. And that can, like we were saying, like hormones play a big role aside from just reproduction. So then that starts to influence things like your bone health, your muscle mass and quality, your recovery, cardiovascular health, like pretty much every system in your body. Because again, your body's just trying to survive. So if you're layering on top of that, like more exercise, more like volume and intensity, again, it creates more stress for the body that it's trying to like protect itself from. So being in that highly stressed state, it's kind of hard to imagine that your body is going to adapt to the training in the way that you want it to, right? You're not going to experience these long-term adaptations. What you might see happening, and I think what we do see happening with a lot of athletes, is like there might be a short-term game, right? Like you lose a bunch of weight, you get lighter and leaner. You might have a great race or two, but then you see them fall kind of like, I don't want to say fall off a cliff, but kind of, right? You see their performance kind of stagnate or, you know, get worse. And it's because the body isn't adapting, right? You're not giving the body the fuel and the energy and the support that it needs to actually do the training that you and perform the way that you want it to. So, you know, like you said, eating more, like that's, I think, where we all need to start from. Like that's the place where we all need to start from, is to make sure that the body just has enough fuel overall, right? And then once the body has enough fuel, like it starts to feel safe and it's like, okay, I don't need to freak out so much. Like I can do these things that you want me to do. And you know, there's so many stories that have been coming out recently. Like one of the stories I talk about in the book is I spoke with some rowers that are on the New Zealand national team, and the New Zealand women's team did phenomenal in the Tokyo Olympics in rowing. But prior to that, like at the 2016 Olympics, right after that, there was like a lot of concern because pretty much everyone on that team was in a state of low energy availability and had some menstrual cycle dysfunction. But as a team and as an organization, they really kind of shifted the focus on eating and just making sure that people were eating enough. And so one of the rowers I spoke with, she's a lightweight rower. She's like, it has been my entire sports career to like cut weight and like restrict. Like that's just how you do things. And she's like, it was really hard to start eating more. But she, like you said, she noticed like when she ate more, she could actually get to the end of her practices and workouts not feeling totally wrecked. Like she felt okay. And that meant she could actually increase it, like work harder and increase the intensity of what she did. And then she got better, like her performance improved. And so it's like, and she wasn't gaining, you know, all this extra weight that she was afraid that she was going to gain. So I think it feels really scary, especially if it's something that like you've been accustomed to or just grown up with. And like, you know, you don't have to be like a pro athlete or an Olympian. I think like most women that I know have grown up with this fear, right? Of like gaining weight and all of this stuff. But yeah, your body is pretty smart. It wants to, generally wants to survive. It generally wants to stay in a state of balance.
Yeah. I loved also that you talked a lot about some of the, you know, like intermittent fasting and keto and all these things that I've always read and been sold on, that they may not be as applicable to women, or they may be applicable in a different way to women than they are to men. And that was interesting too.
Yeah, because, right, like I feel like in some ways we are always looking for like that edge, that thing that we can do that's going to, you know, give us this edge or help us perform better. And those things like these diets seem like the answer, in part because it just seems easy, not easy, but like kind of, right? Like it's easier than actually like putting in all the work to train and all of that stuff. But yeah, it's really hard.
Out of all the research you did, what like couple things did you think were most applicable to cyclists?
I think that the piece around the nutrition, 1,000%. You know, I mean, we were talking before we started recording how I'm not really a cyclist, like I'm more of a runner, but in that same
but she's done an Olympic triathlon, so she is.
And I said that was probably about like 20 years ago. It's probably like the last time I was really on a bike. But like in that same vein, right? You see this a lot with runners, but I feel like the nutrition piece is really important, especially in these sports where body composition seems to matter, right?
Mhm.
And we have all of this language and these ideas about what an ideal cyclist's body looks like and what an ideal runner's body looks like. So I think that piece is really, really important. Just again, like making sure you're eating sufficiently, not only just in one day, but throughout the day. So again, you're not experiencing these huge dips in energy. Because like I said, the body just wants to be like humming along, like in balance. So that was a big piece of it. The other piece, which was again just more eye-opening to me, and maybe because I'm not as a cyclist,
Mhm.
was around the gear, right?
Yeah.
And all this all these issues around saddles and bike shorts and bibs and all of this stuff, and really just being very angry hearing a lot of these stories and how like it's just not even a consideration, right, in terms of what the female anatomy actually is, what type of gear makes sense for that
Yeah.
type of body compared to a man's, versus just taking what the men's saddle and kind of just making it wider, like
Yeah.
sizing it a little
Right.
bit differently. So that made me really mad.
Yeah. Even outside of like some of the things you mentioned, like the saddles and bike shorts and bikes, there got me thinking, I think you were talking about hockey protective gear.
Yeah.
But the same thing goes for female mountain bikers. Like there's so little protective gear actually designed for women. So then you're like wearing this chest protector that's way too wide for a woman, right? Or the neck guards, the neck braces that are like meant for wider shoulders. So that was another area I thought of.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was also sad in that section of the book because you talked about Machines for Freedom and how here was a company that like actually tried to create cycling apparel for women and our special needs. And now Machines for Freedom is no more either.
I was so sad when I heard that
Yeah.
news because like Jen, I mean, it was great to speak with Jen and just
Yeah.
hear her story in general, but like just her commitment and kind of vision to what she was doing was like fantastic. And so I was so sad to hear that they're no longer a brand.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. We had Jen on the podcast a couple of years ago and she was great. The one, I guess still on that chapter too, you had talked about the specialized bikes and like how they did away with women's specific bikes in lieu of creating a wider range of frame sizes. And I totally love that. I support that. I think the one issue I had with it though was you said, well, you can always add like components, like the touch points, like cranks or handlebars or whatever like that, or in the saddle to be more friendly to females. But all those bikes are still stocked with like a men's saddle and the wider handlebars. And so it still becomes a barrier for women where not only do you have to buy the bike, now you're gonna have to replace all these components after the fact, right?
Spending more money on it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think, I know that there's, there has been a lot of discussion around like the bike frames as well as like things like female specific skis and, doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter. But yeah, it was an interesting piece of that chapter on gear and really looking at gear and trying to understand what different companies were trying to do, right? Like yeah, for sure. Things like when it comes to saddles and when it comes to bike shorts, like it makes sense to have something that's, specific to women and women's bodies. But yeah, trying to understand where that line is then between something that is necessary, right, and appropriate versus something that is more like marketing driven, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Because at least like I know growing up for me, it's like they came out with the female specific skis and it was 1,000% like this marketing opportunity to capture this new market versus making something that like actually made sense, right? Like that there was a reason for why these things existed outside of just, well, I can sell pink skis.
Right. I think that, one of the problems is that we've gotten against shrink it and peak it, which 100% we should, but in the process of like maybe sometimes thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Like, we
Yeah.
still need women specific stuff. It just needs to be women specific, not pink.
Yeah.
It needs to be designed
right?
differently
There's a
for women, right? Yeah.
like there's a difference between like the color coat and like the actual design of
Yeah.
the thing.
Yeah. 100%. There was obviously a lot of discouraging things in this book, the lack of data, the lack of research. What are some of what you see as the bright spots? And do you feel optimistic about the future?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do feel optimistic. And I think that's in part to two things. One is just the interest now in female athlete health and performance research, right? And the number of people who are starting to study this field more and really kind of dedicating their work to it. It's phenomenal. And there's some of the like smartest people I've ever spoken to who are so committed to this work and really wanting to get better data out there, better information out there. That's actionable, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not just, oh, let me get published in this academic journal for my career situation. So for me, like just seeing like this growth and interest in actually studying this and understanding like why it's so important has been really heartening. And folks are doing an incredible job just pushing the field forward. Kind of part and parcel to that is really the younger athletes that are coming up now, like the girls and women and young women in high school and especially in college who are, I mean, so like outspoken about the importance of these issues, about the importance of being taken care of as a whole person and not just seen as like someone, just a name on a roster, if that makes sense.
It
right?
does.
Like that they are speaking out, against all of this like crappy stuff that's going on in the NCAA and the collegiate system in general and how they're not being taken care of. They're demanding better. And it's something that I can't imagine having done at their age. Just having the kind of poise and the knowledge and like the courage, frankly, to like speak out against a lot of this. So for me, like seeing this generation come up and really advocate for better has been really inspiring. And it's been, super fun to talk to some of these women and just to hear what they're doing.
What can we as individual women do to advocate for ourselves and advocate for other women athletes? Are there like organizations we should be supporting or donating to? How do we help get more research done?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it does start kind of locally, right? And it's having these conversations with, your running group or your cycling group, folks that you interact with, your family. If you have younger kids and especially girls, like being like a soft and safe place for them to come to talk about this stuff and ask questions about it. But I think like it really does start with having these conversations and really trying to like, again, raise the awareness that like, A, we don't know a lot of this stuff, but B, like, it's just physiology, right? Like, it's not something we should be embarrassed about talking about or ashamed about talking about, but that it's part of the lived experience of girls and women. And if you play sports and if you want to be active or performance driven, like it's going to be part of your experience, right? So I think it's having those conversations at schools too. Again, like if you have kids in schools, talking to the coaches or even talking to coaches like for like the rec soccer league or for, the cycling mountain biking clinic for your girls that you might be doing on the weekends or something like that. But just like, again, making it so that, we're starting to talk about these things just more casually and more frequently. And I think that that's a big piece of it. Because again, what I've noticed, at least with my book being published, is like I'm getting a lot of great response and like it's being embraced by like very specific communities, right? Like the folks who care about this, like your community and other running communities and other women's sports communities who understand why this is important, right? But like these are folks who are really seeped in this. But what I find is harder sometimes is like when I have like casual conversations with my neighbors or something, they're like, well, that's interesting. It's like that doesn't apply to me or something, or that's interesting. But just trying to help folks understand. It's like, well, no, it doesn't matter kind of like what level you are, but this is
Yeah.
information like we all should be aware of, we all should be talking about, that matters to everyone. It doesn't, it's not just for like the elite club teams or,
Mhm.
racing teams or whatever it is, but it matters for everyone.
Yeah. I think too, you spend a lot of time talking about sports bras and how just something as simple as a sports bra
Yeah,
keeps
yeah.
women from exercising and being active. And as a small trusted woman, that's not like a real issue I have, but that was
Same.
fascinating to me.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, that was like super eye-opening to me in a lot of ways because yeah, I like it wasn't really an issue for
Mhm.
me. But the fact that, you know, breast pain, accessibility to sports bras is such a huge barrier to physical activity for such a large swath of people out there, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, it makes sense. If your boobs hurt while you're exercising, you're going to be less likely to want to do it. Or if you're
Right.
embarrassed by it, right? Like, and this is especially for like younger girls who are just developing, they're embarrassed by like their boobs, their breasts moving and people commenting on it or something like that. Maybe because they don't have access to those sports bras. So there are some great organizations out there that are trying to make sports bras more available to girls across the board. I'm totally forgetting the name. I think it is like sport, like Bras for Girls
Okay.
is the name of an organization that does a lot of this work. They've partnered with Oiselle, the women's running company brand, so that like if you buy like certain bras, they'll donate a bra, that type of thing. But it's stuff like that that makes a difference. It's stuff like making, again, in schools, making sure that they have period products in the locker room for girls.
Yeah.
So it's not just on the girls to remember, or to make sure that they have a pad or a tampon or whatever, right? And so they don't have to then feel embarrassed about going to their coach saying like, hey coach, I can't practice today, especially since most coaches still are men, right? Saying I can't practice
Yeah.
today, I have my period, I don't have a tampon. That's not a conversation I would have wanted to have with
No.
my coaches,
Right.
right? But it's something as simple as that, just making sure that they're period products, right? And it's a
Yeah.
pretty small lift.
Yeah. Speaking of girls, I'm sure there are plenty of listeners listening who have daughters. What advice would you give them?
It's so hard.
Yeah.
Like it's such a hard, tricky time because, and I don't think I appreciated this as enough, is that adolescence is such a tremendous period of growth. And I think we only think about it, right, in the sense that you shoot up in height. But the amount of growth that's happening in your body is on par with like the amount of growth that happens like in your very early years, like when you're like 1, 2, that type of growth, like your body is changing so much. So I think like understanding that and putting that in perspective kind of gives parents the perspective that like, oh, there's so much going on here, maybe like we need to adjust for that, or maybe we need to just be aware of this transitional period, and she might need time to just adapt to her new body, and B, we just recognize that the body is transforming so much, and so maybe we need to kind of do some things differently. So the way that I kind of think about it is that, how when you blow glass, like it's all molten and like you're like shaping it and you can kind of like, add divots or like put, kind of shape it in whatever form you want. And then when it cools off, it's in its like final like crystalline form.
Right.
That's kind of how I think of adolescence, is that really molten form where like they're growing into their adult shape. But it's also really fragile, right? And so it's also this period of time, if you like touch it, you can create that divot and it'll stay there, right? And it can create these lasting impacts that kind of last throughout your adulthood. So I think, for girls, for parents of girls, it's understanding this transition period, and B, that there are, depending on kind of the developmental phase that they're at, right? So whether they're pre-puberty, they're in puberty, they're in their like very like fast growth stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they're just shooting up and can't keep up with feeding them and like their shoe size and like clothes and all of this stuff. Like you need to pay attention to kind of volume and intensity during those like critical points, right? So it might be different depending on their phase of development. And I think the other thing to just keep in mind is that it's just, and it's really hard, especially with teenagers, it's just helping them be patient and helping them understand that this is a normal, natural, I don't like the word natural, but like this is a normal period of development.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody goes through this.
Mm-hmm.
This, you have to go through this phase to get from being a child to being an adult. And it's okay. And things like your menstrual cycle is normal. Because I think for a lot of girls, we often look to the pro athletes and the elites, or the, you know, these adult women with these, you know, very specific body shapes and sizes that we talked about before. But it's understanding like those are grown women too, right? Like your
Right.
body, it needs to grow and change and do what it needs to do, but you will eventually get there. And, you know, if you allow your body to just go through its maturational process, it'll serve everyone in the end. It'll serve you athletically, it'll serve you like health wise,
Yeah.
and longevity and all of that. But it's hard. It's a hard thing to try to explain, right, to a 13, 14, 15-year-old who's like, go away.
Yeah, don't want to listen to you.
I don't want to hear like just be patient. I mean, because like you know, on the opposite side of that, I have two boys, but like on the opposite side of that, I have like one kid who is like a real like early developer, right? And like shot up and you know, and all of this. And I have on the other end, some, you know, my younger son is on the slower end, or like a late bloomer. I don't even want to call him a late bloomer, but like he's not at the same pace as his brother.
Yeah.
And so it's so frustrating for him. He's like, I don't want to hear that I'm gonna grow. Like, I just want to grow. I'm like, I get it, but it's so hard.
Yeah, I also have a son, and I actually really enjoyed, even though it was meant for females, like your chapter on youth sports. And I think that was worth all parents reading that chapter also.
Yeah.
I have one final question for you, but before I do that, where can people find your book and how can they come connect with you?
Sure. So the book is Up to Speed, The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes. It's available as hardcover, as an ebook, as an audiobook, and should be available wherever books are sold, or at your local public library. And then people can find me on Instagram at CYU888. That's probably the easiest. I have links from there to all the other places you can find.
And we'll include all those links in the show description too. Okay, so final question for you is, I mean, this book had so much good information in it. I dog-eared it and highlighted it and did all kinds of stuff. So much good information. But if somebody was going to read this and only take away one message, like what would you want that one message to be?
Oh my gosh. You would think that by now I should have a prepared answer for something like this, but I totally don't. I think that the one message that I want, so thinking like specifically for girls and women, is that women, like, there is no expiration date or point on one's active or performance life. We all go through these periods of transition by nature of the fact that we live in female bodies. That's our reality, right? So we have puberty, we might have pregnancy and postpartum, and we'll have like the menopause transition. But all of those are periods of transition, and they don't necessarily need to signal like the end of your athletic goals, the end of your athletic life and pursuits. But it might mean that, you know, you kind of you have to adjust things, right? To kind of readapt to your body as it moves through these different phases and as it comes through on the other side. But in no way, shape, or form does it mean that like you can't do something.
I love that.